Bueno, a partir de ahora empezamos ya varias horas de análisis y de confrontación de ideas desde la experiencia y el conocimiento de todos los ponentes que nos van a acompañar en esta mañana. Pero antes de comenzar, como hacemos todos los años, les advertimos a los presentes de la obligación de respetar escrupulosamente las normas de defensa de la competencia. En concreto, se recuerda la necesidad de evitar en el desarrollo de la sesión todo intercambio de información relacionada con información comercial sensible, como es toda aquella que haga referencia a la facturación, los precios, las inversiones, los costes o los clientes. En ese mismo sentido, se recuerda la obligación de evitar cualquier debate sobre la política comercial y cualquier tipo de aspecto que pueda derivar en una limitación de la autonomía de comportamiento o reducción de cualquier forma la incertidumbre sobre el comportamiento en el mercado. Una vez hecha esta advertencia, ha llegado el momento de escuchar a nuestro primer ponente. Es un lujo contar hoy con su presencia. Es un referente en el análisis de mercados, un profesional prestigioso que cuenta con todas las claves sobre tendencias y previsiones. Sonríe, incluso en estos tiempos plagados de incertidumbre. Está hoy aquí para hablar del mercado global del papel recuperado, el primer asunto que vamos a tratar en profundidad. Damos la bienvenida a Alejandro Mata, Director Europe Packaging and Graphic Papers de Fastmakers. Gracias por acompañarnos, señor Mata.
Gracias.
Adelante, gracias.
Muy bien. ¿Me escuchan bien todos? Sí, ¿verdad? Ok. Primero que nada, una disculpa anticipada porque mi presentación la voy a hacer en inglés, no en español. Me pueden hacer todas las preguntas en español que quieran, pero mi agenda fue muy apretada estos últimos días y me fue imposible hacer la preparación para esta presentación en inglés. Y quiero tener el tiempo suficiente de hablar de todas las cosas que tengo en mi presentación y haciéndolo en español a veces me tardo un poco más. Así que prefiero dejarlo en inglés, pero siéntanse con confianza de hacer cualquier tipo de pregunta que tengan durante la sesión de preguntas y respuestas o durante la comida o los descansos en español. Bueno, ¿de qué voy a estar hablando? Voy a estar hablando mucho al principio de mercados que no son realmente de papel reciclado. Va a ser más bien del tema de papel, de cartón, de la fabricación de papel y cartón y de las tendencias que estamos viendo en Europa. Cambio a inglés ahora. So, yeah, we are really leaving behind the big fluctuation, the big volatility that we observed over the past 2 to 3 years in the European market, but also that extends to many other markets in the world. And although we are leaving that volatility behind, we're still facing very significant challenges for the next coming years. And some of my presentation will be going into those topics. My presentation, or at least the first part of my presentation, will be organized in 3 different topics that will become very clear once I start talking about them. So I'm not going to spend too much time on explaining what each figure represents. But generally speaking, and before I go into what it means, those 5 million tons, I show you in the graph the information containing the supply and demand for European containerboard. You see the absolute figures for demand, for capacity on the gray area, production on the purple bars, and then you have the operating rates on the orange line. So I think the first very visual thing that comes to you when you look at that figure is the really dramatic drop in operating rates that we have since 2022. So those 5 million tons, what they represent is the excess supply that we see in the market if we would assume the market to return to a balanced supply and demand position, which means operating rates, instead of being around 81% at the end of the forecast period, they will be around 90%. So the difference is quite huge. 5 million tons of oversupply. Hold on. There. 5 million tons of excess supply during the next 2 years. And now, you can perhaps think about 2 things when you look at this figure. First, a realization that the industry is at the moment really carrying on a lot of excess supply. The other one is perhaps a mistake on our side that we are underestimating production growth for the next 2 years. And perhaps the growth in production would allow for that capacity to be absorbed in a faster way than what we are forecasting. And I'll try to address the two topics during my presentation. But let's first go into the production side and giving you a bit more information about the figures for Europe. So what you have here is the absolute numbers for European containerboard and production growth. So you have two lines there. The solid line is the actuals and the forecast in the solid lighter color line. The dotted line is the historical long-term average. So you can see already that in 2020, the second half of 2020, and most of 21, beginning of 22, the industry was really performing above the historical average. It was doing much better. It has to do with the rebound from the conditions that Europe went through since the start of the pandemic. It has also to do with a good macroeconomic development, a rebound from the pandemic, but situation changed rapidly. By the third quarter of 22, the demand situation started changing. We saw a lot of destocking. We saw a lot of the trends that emerged since the pandemic continuing and changing some of the patterns for consumption in Europe. And I'll talk a bit more about that. But the reality and the main message of this slide from my side is that although in 24 and 25 we are expecting growth on the production for containerboard to return and to be more or less at the same level as the long-term average, we are still below that long-term average from a volume perspective. We are not going back. We're not recovering what was lost in 21 and 22 yet. It's going to take a little longer for that catching up to the long-term average. Now, I'll present you a bit more details on what is driving that behavior, what drove the reduction in 22 and 23, and what might be some of the clues of what we can expect going forward. So this first figure is showing you the decomposition of where the money is going from a household consumption point of view. You have the percentage or the breakdown between goods and services. And we can see that already at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a shift. People, because of the lockdowns, they were unable to spend on services as much as before, and there was a compensation. There was more of the household expenditures going into consumption of goods instead of services. So that already gives you a clue on why second half of 2020 and 21, we saw more consumption of packaging, and this has also to do with e-commerce enabling consumers to really spend more on goods than services during this period. What happened since then? We have seen the reopening of economies. We are not seeing more lockdowns imposed in Europe, so consumers really went back to consuming of services. Tourism came back, and we are seeing a shift back to services again. So that also explains one of the reasons why we have seen a change in dynamics since the second half of 22 of consumption for containerboard going down as well. It has to do with how consumers are spending their money and where that money is going, either goods or services. The other interesting point is e-commerce. And as I just said before, e-commerce really helped to enable consumers to spend on goods, more on goods than services during the first years after the pandemic. The problem is that pure e-commerce companies like Amazon, they really were under stress, under a lot of stress because of the amount of excess demand that they saw during this period. So there was a lot of excess packaging and packaging waste generated during this period. And I think we all have experienced this when we buy through e-commerce channels. They are gradually becoming more conscious about this problem, and they are acting to it. They are using artificial intelligence. They are using softwares to try to reduce the size of the packaging of the corrugated box to better fit the products that are packed inside. But they're also thinking on what kind of packaging, primary packaging, is needed. Is it really a corrugated box that is needed for the shipping of that product, or it can go into a flexible packaging? So all of this also goes on top of what we just mentioned in explaining why the demand patterns changed so much over the past 2 years. And this is the last one I'm showing you from a macroeconomic point of view, macroeconomic perspective, and it has to do with retail trade. And focusing first on what I have on the left side there, that's retail trade in two different ways, looked into different ways. You have the turnover, or the total value of retail trade on the white line, and then you have the volume or the deflated turnover on the pink line. So if you see at the white line, you would perhaps be shocked when I was saying demand for containerboard was not good in 22 and 23, because the line still is shooting to the sky. The reality is that the demand or the consumption for containerboard looks much closer to the pink line, which is the deflated, which is the volume, the true volume trend behind retail trade in Europe when we take the inflation out of the picture. So that's one thing. The other thing, and the last macro data that I will mention, is on the right side. On that little bar chart, what I'm showing you is the proportion of savings from European population. At the moment, the rate of saving is around 15%, which is much higher than the historical average of around 11 to 12%. It is much higher than what we saw during the financial crisis, the previous financial crisis in 2008, 2009. Definitely not to the same levels where we had it during the start of the pandemic, but it does reflect consumer sentiment for the economy. At the moment, the consumer is still cautious about where they spend their money, and they're actually saving more in preparation of what could be a difficult year in 2024. And that, again, is affecting consumption at the moment. Then, just to bring back all this talk about the demand for packaging to the supply side of the industry. And in here, what I'm showing you is the year-on-year change in demand, on the year-on-year change in production on the gray bars, the year-on-year change in capacity on the blue bars, and you have the operating rates again. So there's no surprise on the operating rate line. But you now perhaps visualize better the reasons why operating rates were coming down so much since 2022. You can see that the production change in 22 and 23 were very, very negative. And although we had a very strong reduction in production, we still saw capacity coming in. There is a numerous number of capacity of projects coming in on the recycled containerboard, on the virgin containerboard market during this period, 22-23, and we are expecting to see many more for the next 4 to 5 years. Operating rates have reacted to that, and the market condition at the moment is not really supportive for so much capacity coming in. And I think that's one of the reasons why we are seeing more companies taking market-related downtime. That's why we are seeing more of these projects being delayed or canceled, and we might see more going forward depending on how much the market recovers in the coming months. So that talks about the first part of my presentation, the 5 million tons, which is sort of highlighting what the challenge is for the industry. Now, the second part of my presentation addresses the second point on whether we are forecasting not sufficient production growth, and we're going to see what the potential is, or what Europe will need to do from a production growth point of view to go back to that balanced market situation of 90% operating rate. So the graph says it clearly. You have the red line as the average operating rate of 90%, and you see how low it will be by 2025. And you see how low it is already now, which is below that 90% operating rate. So for Europe to go back to balanced market, 90%, leaving capacity untouched, Europe will need to produce up to 3 times more than what we are forecasting at the moment. What we are forecasting, you're seeing it on the gray portions of those bars. That's the year-on-year change in production. And what we need on top of that is shown on the purple bars, 4.6 million tons of additional production to go back to a market operating rate of 90%. Only from a production growth point of view, this already represents a challenge. Europe has never grown so much in its history. Having these 4.6 million tons will represent Europe growing or having the two best years in a consecutive way for over the past 20 to 30 years. So that already represents a challenge. But not only that, this increase in production will need to go somewhere. We either have stronger domestic demand growth or we have more exports. It needs to go somewhere. Inventories cannot absorb this amount of excess production. And that's what I'm trying to explain on this chart, and I'll talk gradually through it. First of all, I want to focus on the domestic demand growth and the potential for further growth compared to what we are forecasting. Focus your attention on the black line. That's our forecast demand growth for European containerboard. And you can see the last 2 points in 24-25. They are basically saying European containerboard demand will grow between 2 and 3% during those 2 years, which is more or less very close to the historical average. Yeah? So what if we increase that to the maximum level we have seen European containerboard demand growing in normal times? And what normal times I consider is, I just exclude those 3 years which are rebounds from periods of crises. So in those periods, of course, we have growth that goes beyond what is normal. If we take those 3 years out, the maximum we have seen the European containerboard demand growing is 4.5%. So if instead of 2.3, between 2 and 3, that is what I'm currently forecasting, we go all the way to 4.5, European domestic demand will be able to absorb about 1 out of those 4.6 million tons of additional production. There's still 3.5, 3.6 that need to go somewhere, and that somewhere will need to be exports. There's many possible scenarios of this. I'm just presenting one for conversation purposes. 3.5 million tons of additional exports. Is that possible? In a way, it's going to be also very challenging. Europe has never exported so much. An excess of 3.5 or an additional 3.5 million tons of exports means doubling our exports forecast. And that will mean that if you see on the little red red area chart that I have on the right, that's the European export share of production. The European share of production has always been between 3 and 5% historically. You can see it for the last 30, 40 years, it has always been around 3 to 5. In 2020, there were specific conditions that favored a lot the growth of exports, recycled containerboard exports, and we went to 8% that year. But if we put the 3.5 million tons on top of what we currently have, we end up with a European share of production going almost to 15%. And Europe, again, has never exported so much. And the difficulty is that Europe is going through very difficult times from a paper-making point of view, and that's my last, the discussion of my last point on the presentation. All the conditions that we currently see in Europe do not favor Europe exporting so much more going into the next 2 years. All right, last point, European paper-making in uncharted territory, and I think we will be discussing a lot about that during this seminar, this Congress. And basically, I'm focusing on 2 things. One is legislation. I'm going to talk very briefly about it. It has to do with fiber and fiber availability in Europe, and it has to do with the cost competitiveness of European assets when you look at it from a global perspective. So first of all, this is just a list of some of the many legislations that are taking shape at the moment. Some of them are more disruptive for our industries than others. In particular, I usually focus on 2 of them that are very, very damaging, or very, I would not say damaging, because they are still in the process of being shaped, but they have the potential to be very impactful for the industry. And those are the packaging and packaging waste regulation and the European deforestation regulation. Not that I'm under-stressing the other ones, but these 2 are of particular, require particular attention. I'm not going to talk too much about the deforestation regulation because it's more about the virgin fiber topic, but I'll shortly talk about the packaging and packaging waste regulation. So I think the problems with the packaging and packaging waste regulation for our industry, or the challenges that we see from our fiber-based packaging industries, the fight between reuse and recycle. Yeah, we have seen how the legislation was favoring more reuse than recycle. And the other point was the topic about the closed product loop when recycling fibers. And what that means is, if you have a corrugated box, when you recycle the fibers of that corrugated box, usually we need to go to the making of another corrugated box. As we heard in the morning, the legislation is changing, and it's changing favorably to our industries. The targets that I mentioned on the left side are not applicable anymore, considering the changes that we saw a week ago. The closed product loop statement is also rephrased, and we are seeing less of a potential impact for our industries right now. But as you can see, when I did the slide, basically 2 weeks ago, we didn't have the revision that we saw happening last week, and then out of the sudden, the picture changes again. And we are not yet over. We are still in the process of shaping these legislations, and that's the reason why paying attention to what the legislations say and paying attention to how they are being shaped is so important for not only your industry, but the entire paper and board industry in Europe. The other challenge that we have has to do with the cost competitiveness, and in particular has to do with the European energy situation. A lot of the paper making in Europe is very exposed to natural gas, especially on the recycled containerboard side. Up to 80% of the production is still based in natural gas in some way or another. So natural gas prices are very important. Already in 22, when we saw the high volatility, every time the natural gas price was above 150 euros per megawatt hour, capacities or some producers were already stopping to produce because they could not afford the price for natural gas. At the moment, we are at 50, and we might see some more volatility going forward, especially if the winter conditions are as bad as what we're going to see in these coming days. But there will be a lot more volatility, and if you have questions, feel free to reach out and talk to me. I have a lot of very strong points on what I think and what Fast Markets thinks on the European energy markets for the next 3 to 5 years. The last point on this topic is just driving the point on cost competitiveness and how Europe compares to the other regions in the world. So first, I explain you how to read this chart. On the vertical axis, you have the cash cost to produce 1 ton of paper. On the horizontal axis, you have the tons, the million tons of capacity. And you have the 3 regions in different colors. You have North America, Europe, and Asia. And for every region, I give you different points in time. So going back to the first quarter of 2020, which is shown on the bottom dotted line there, Europe was the lowest cost producer for testliner in the world. We were the cheapest region to produce testliner. If we fast forward a bit more than 2 years and a half, and we go to the third quarter of 22, Europe went from being the lowest cost producer to the highest cost producer in the world, and by a big margin. Since then, the situation has changed. Europe has regained some of the lost competitiveness. And at the moment, if you see the second dotted line, second quarter 23, we are still more expensive than North America. We are basically at the same level as the average producer in Asia, which is completely different to what we were having a bit more than 2 years ago. We had an advantage of about 150 euros per ton compared to the Asian producers. That competitiveness is still not recovered. So this already explains why European exports have been so much challenged over the past 2 to 3 years. So summarizing the first part of my presentation, the challenge is clear: 5 million tons of excess supply. We have consumer probably trying to demand a bit more or increasing the production to compensate for this excess supply, but that we need to see it in the framework of really more challenging times from a European paper-making point of view. And reality is that never before the fate of the industry was in hands of people from outside of the industry. And I think that's one of the things that we need to pay attention more and more going forward. We need to help all the people that is making these legislations to understand what the realities, what the complexities of our industries are, for those legislations to really achieve the goals that they are intended to achieve, but also protecting the interests of our industries. Repacar also asked me to put a few slides on graphics, so it really doesn't fit in any of my two parts of the presentation, but I'll just squeeze in a few messages on European graphics. You see a lot of similarities with what I've been saying about containerboard. The demand for graphics, graphics has been an industry that has been in decline for more than 10 years, so it is not changing. We are seeing still demand declining very fast. We saw that demand collapsed in the beginning of 2020, and we did saw a very strong recovery in 21, but we have left that recovery period behind, and we are really in a very accelerated mode for graphic demand. What the reasons are, destocking has to do with it, but it has also to do with pricing, and I'm not saying anything about price forecasting. I'm just reflecting on what prices historically have done to accelerate the trends we have seen on the demand side. Prices for coated wood-free and for coated mechanical have never been as high as they were a year ago, and even now that they have started to come down, we are still seeing very high price levels compared to history. And if you think about all the publishers, they have fixed paper budgets that when you see prices going up so much, that basically translates into fewer tons being consumed. So this is another reason why we have seen an acceleration on that demand reduction. I'm going to skip this one due to time, but it's just showing you how every grade has accelerated its pace of demand reductions. By the way, you will get all the slides after the presentation, so you will have all the details here. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. In the end, we are seeing still a strong disconnection between supply and demand for graphics. The reductions that we're seeing on the production side are not yet being compensated by reductions in capacity, as you can see here. Production on the purple bars, capacity on the gray bars. Again, year-on-year changes here. For the next 2 years, 24 and 25, we're seeing much more capacity reductions, but the problem is about 40 to 50% of the reductions that I have in my forecast right now are based on our own assumptions on what the market will do. They are not based on announcements from companies. And that proportion is rather high this time. I always track this number, and usually the assumptions will represent between 15 to 30% of the assumed capacity closures. Right now, it's a bit higher when I look into my models. All right. Going to the last topic of my presentation, the global RCP markets, the global recovered paper markets. This part of the presentation is not my baby, it's not my market. It is a presentation prepared by Hannah. So if you have questions on this side of the presentation, I'll be doing my best to answer, but I might need to defer some of those to Hannah. So the first slide basically showing you the pricing trend, the pricing history until now. You can see that the markets for OCC have been rather weak for the past year and a half. You see those trends on all the 4 regions that I'm showing here. Particularly for Asia, and I think for everybody, for all the regions, the demand for packaging papers have a lot of explaining to do. And I think we have already left clear on my first part of the presentation how weak demand for packaging papers has been in 22 and 23. So we do see that reflected in the prices for OCC as well. I think one area that behaves slightly different is North America. Prices for North America has been increasing for 7 months in a row. So it means that the market for OCC in the US is a bit tighter. That said, consumption of containerboard in North America is still declining between 2 and 3% over the past 2 years. So it is a bit weird dynamic happening at the moment over there. When we see at the demand for OCC in the US, it's basically what I was just mentioning now. The demand, which is on the orange bars, you see that they are coming down on average from the 22 levels. So demand is lower than a year ago. You can see the inventories in days of supply on the blue bar, which are also trending up. So those two tendencies, in a way, are more supporting of prices, of pricing pressure, rather than prices to go high, and that's what we actually have seen. So this is more a reflection of the capacity starts that we have seen in the US this year, about 1.5 million tons of new recycled containerboard mills and recycled pulp mills demanding more OCC. And they are perhaps a bit more eager to pay higher prices to secure the fibers, especially when some of the market discussions are going into not sufficient generation. And that's my next point. Low generation in the US, is it really there? Is it really something? When you see at the figures, it is. It is something that worries especially these newcomers into the industry. We have box shipments on the purple bar, on the purple line, really coming down, so there's less material to be recollected. But also, the US being a big importer, a big consumer, if you see at the imports of consumer goods coming into the US, it is also trending down. So the recollections as such are trending down at the moment. So lower generation, lower recollection also means US is limited in the amount of exports. And we are seeing a reduction in the exports going to Asia, going to Latin America. Not everywhere. There's a few particular markets where we're seeing more OCC exports from the US. But in general, we're seeing a reduction of US exports of OCC. The next figure is just showing you the opposite picture from the Asian market. What Asia is reporting, it's importing from the world. So remember, US went down by 15% its OCC exports. Asia has increased its OCC imports by 30%. So the trends are completely opposite. So US is definitely exporting less to Asia, and some of that we have seen as a gain for regions like Europe, like Japan, like Australia. So we do see some of that change in the flows on the OCC market. Now, we see that there was a surge in OCC imports in the later part of 22, as the market was expecting to see a strong recovery in the beginning of 23. That it never happened, so that's why we have seen OCC imports in Asia coming down already since the second and third quarter of 23. Now, I was mentioning not every market is the same. I'm showing you one example, Thailand. Thailand is importing more OCC from the US because of the high quality of these fibers. And the interesting thing is that when you see the imports of OCC in Thailand and you compare them to the exports of recycled pulp going to China, they are correlating very strongly. So what is happening in Thailand is just a swing. It's just a correction for the import bans that we saw in China applying already in 21. And when we look at the market for the Chinese recycled pulp, so the imports of recycled pulp in China, we have seen an increase of 45%, 46% for the first 9 months of the year, which is, again, another figure that seems not to fit in the picture, because we've been talking about how demand for packaging papers is so weak, even in Asia. The problem is, and the reason for that is more related to the pricing. The prices for recycled pulp in China are low compared to the price of domestic collected OCC. The price differential between domestic OCC in China and recycled pulp is about $15 to $20 per ton at the moment. So producers are willing to pay a little extra for the better fiber composition that they get from the recycled pulp side. And in a way, China has been struggling with this dilemma for some years. Since the banning of papers for recycling, they have increased domestic collection. They are using also a bit more virgin fibers. Unfortunately, the type of virgin fibers that they're using are of low quality, so in general, it is not helping to improve the overall quality of the fiber pool they have in Asia, and that's why they are reverting to recycled pulp imports. Now, there's many questions on how this can develop in the coming years, as many other markets outside of China are trying to replicate the same legislations or the same bannings that China did in 21. So we might see more issues to continue improving the situation for the China and the Asian recycled fiber quality. My last slide, the situation for Western Europe. We're seeing on the orange bars the demand for OCC in Europe coming down in 22 and in 23. That is basically straightly related to what I was mentioning for containerboard overall. Containerboard production in Europe was down 5.3, 5.4% in 22, 3.5, 3.6% in 23, and that explains why consumption of recovered papers have been coming down those 2 years. Exports also continue trending down, but we are expecting to see a slight recovery in 23 and 24, but with more capacity joining the market, we will see those exports, especially the share of those exports from the total market, to start going down again. I have a few summary points, but I will let you read those. I think we are out of time anyway. I will just leave time for Q&A if you have any question at this moment.
Si le parece, puede tomar asiento. Vamos a abrir un turno de preguntas del público, así que si ustedes tienen alguna duda o alguna... Ya me levantan la mano a la izquierda, si pueden acercarle el micrófono. Perfecto.
Hola,
Perfecto.
buenos días.
Buenos días.
Buenos días, señor Mata. Gracias por la presentación. La verdad es que muy buena y muy interesante. Usted nos comentaba, si no he visto mal, el cierre de 7 millones de toneladas en papeles gráficos entre el 23 y el 25 aproximadamente. ¿Hay alguna cifra de cierres también de máquinas quizás menos competitivas en el sector del packaging?
Sí las hay, sí han habido cierres. Recientemente Smurfit Kappa ha tomado ciertas acciones, Smurfit Kappa ha tomado ciertas acciones, y más de los cierres que hemos visto es en empresas pequeñas en el área de material para empaque reciclado, no tanto en el área virgen, y tiene que ver con la pérdida de competitividad y cómo los costos de producción se están afectando más en el área de papel reciclado que papel de materia virgen. Pero sí han habido, no han habido demasiadas, es un número relativamente pequeño de plantas que han cerrado. Hay más plantas que están tomando un paro de mercado por razones de insuficiencia de demanda, pero son paros temporales, no son paros permanentes todavía.
Sí, es que a eso me refiero, es decir, viendo las cifras de sobrecapacidad aparente en Europa de estos 5 millones de toneladas, viendo que solo 1 millón de toneladas, si la demanda crece lo que se espera, se tienen que exportar 3,6, ya hemos visto las dificultades para exportar las 3,6. Entonces, en definitiva, lamentablemente, y lo subrayo varias veces, lamentablemente tendremos que ver ajustes de la oferta, sí, porque si no, el balance no llegará.
Sí. De momento, lo que hemos visto más como acciones de la industria han sido en el tema de paros temporales y de retrasos o cancelaciones de los proyectos que se estaban planeando para los siguientes 2-3 años, pero ha sido todavía muy poco en el tema de paro de capacidad. Pero tiene que suceder si queremos ver que los ratios operativos de este mercado suban un poco más rápido, si no, estaríamos hablando de varios años con ratios operativos por muy debajo de lo que es la norma para este mercado.
Gracias. ¿Alguna pregunta más? ¿Alguien se anima? Bueno, mientras esperamos a ver si alguien se anima,
Sí.
a mí me han surgido algunas dudas escuchándole o algunos asuntos en los que creo que igual conviene detenerse. Por fijar un poco el fin de esta volatilidad, que ya sé que es difícil, no tenemos una bola de cristal, ¿habría que poner la vista en el año 2025, más o menos? ¿O es imposible fijar una fecha en la que el mercado pueda estabilizarse? El cambio de comportamiento de los consumidores, la inflación, los precios del gas.
En cuanto a precios de gas, va a tomar más tiempo. Mis pronósticos en el tema energético todavía muestran mucha volatilidad por los siguientes 4 a 5 años.
4 o 5 años.
Todavía vamos a ver bastante volatilidad en ese tema. En cuanto a costos de producción en general, todavía estamos viendo muchas razones del por qué Europa va a seguir por debajo de lo que tenía como competitividad en el 2018-2019.
¿Sí?
Tenemos los precios de las emisiones de CO2, por ejemplo, que siguen subiendo. Tenemos los gastos de transportación internas que todavía siguen elevados. Y fuera de eso todavía se está viendo bastante inflación comparado a las otras regiones del mundo. En cuanto a la demanda, a lo mejor 2024-2025 vamos a ver un regreso a normalidad como veamos el comportamiento del consumidor, pero eso no significa que la demanda o las dinámicas de demanda para el mercado van a regresar a la normalidad. Uno de los ejemplos que di es, por ejemplo, e-commerce y todo el movimiento que hay para tratar de hacer sus empaques más efectivos, más eficientes, reducir los costos de transportación, que van en cuenta también para la reducción de CO2 de estas compañías. Eso va a tomar todavía un poco más de tiempo que estos 2 años que tenemos por futuro.
Sobre los competidores que te referías a ellos también en una de las últimas diapositivas, has hablado de China. China es un territorio al que hay que mirar de cerca, pero también destacabas que Norteamérica es un competidor que ahora nos está poniendo las cosas difíciles, en parte porque ellos no tienen tantos costes de producción, ¿no? Y la inflación no les está afectando tanto. ¿En quién hay que fijarse más a medio plazo?
En Asia. En Asia y en Latinoamérica. Latinoamérica está haciendo cosas interesantes. Asia, simplemente por la cantidad de exceso de producción que tienen. Los ratios operativos en Europa están al 81%, en Asia están por debajo del 70%. Entonces eso los está poniendo en una posición muy difícil en la que tienen que exportar lo más que puedan. La cantidad de capacidad que se está instalando en Asia todavía es muy grande. Yo di el número de 5 millones de toneladas de exceso de capacidad en el mercado europeo para empaque. Globalmente, y es un número que revisé hace una semana, estamos hablando de 27 millones de exceso de toneladas de capacidad a nivel mundial.
Estamos en las mayores cifras que se han,
sí,
históricas.
De esos 27 millones, 15 más o menos están en Asia. Entonces el problema en Asia sigue siendo muy fuerte. Vamos a ver más competencia de Asia. ¿Por qué menciono Latinoamérica? Latinoamérica está siendo muy creativo en el aspecto de desarrollo de nuevos productos que pueden hacer que la competitividad de esta región se vuelva un poco más atractiva y veamos a Latinoamérica también exportando un poco más hacia el mundo.
Y una última cosa, reutilizar y reciclar no son incompatibles.
No.
Para nada, todo lo contrario. Es un reto también del sector, un desafío al que el sector tiene que enfrentarse y en el que se tiene que empeñar.
Sí,
en que convivan.
Sí. Yo creo que el problema de lo que hemos visto hasta el momento es simplemente no suficiente tiempo para analizar todas las opciones por parte de la gente que está diseñando estas legislaciones. No nada más por el impacto directo que puede tener en la industria del papel reciclado, pero al final de cuentas, el objetivo de muchas de estas legislaciones, y citando the Packaging Waste Regulation, es reducir el desperdicio o el desperdicio de plástico. Con la legislación como estaba hasta hace 2 semanas, había un riesgo de que se incentivara el consumo de plástico en vez de reducir el consumo de plástico. Entonces, el tener un entendimiento completo de cuáles son las consecuencias de las legislaciones que se están formando, pues es muy importante.
¿Usted cree que las legislaciones están bien pensadas?
Están... no quiero responder a esa pregunta directamente.
Lo siento, ya sé que no es su tema y que luego vamos a abordarlo, pero por introducir uno de los temas estrella de este
Lo que voy a decir
mañana.
es, en la forma original las legislaciones no estaban bien concebidas.
¿Sí?
Pero afortunadamente hemos visto que la gente a cargo de estas legislaciones está escuchando y estamos viendo cambios muy positivos a estas legislaciones.
Bueno, está bien que escuchen y que le den una pensada. ¿Alguna pregunta que se les haya ocurrido en esta mini entrevista que hemos hecho? Sí, tenemos un señor a la derecha, gracias.
Sí. ¿Se oye?
A ver si se le escucha.
¿Se escucha?
Sí, perfectamente.
Sí, no.
Adelante, gracias.
Con todo el movimiento y con todo el exceso de toneladas que vemos que hay en Europa, ¿cómo va a afectar o cómo ve la tendencia del coste del flete? Es decir, sabemos muchas veces que hay momentos en que no se puede exportar porque el precio de transporte es muy elevado, sin embargo los fletes son realmente baratos ahora para poder exportar a Asia. ¿Cómo ve esa tendencia con todos los cambios legislativos que van a haber y con todo el tema de emisiones de CO2 de todos los buques que van a Asia?
Sí, es una buena pregunta. Yo creo que no vamos a ver un retorno de los costos en fletes tan exponenciales que vimos recientemente. Creo que hubieron condiciones muy específicas del por qué se vivió eso. En parte, una consolidación muy particular de las líneas de fletes marítimo y una reactivación de la demanda de productos empacados en Asia y en todo el mundo. Entonces, fue una de las muchas razones del por qué vimos esa inflación en los fletes. No creo que vayamos a ver una situación similar en el futuro, pero sí, como comentas tú, sobre todo en el tema del medio ambiente, la generación de CO2, pueden haber todavía más regulaciones que puedan hacer que estos fletes incrementen. Yo, de momento, en el corto plazo, veo menos volatilidad, menos riesgos en los fletes a nivel exterior, por decirlo así, exportaciones de Europa hacia Asia, Norteamérica u otras regiones. Veo todavía más complicaciones en la transportación interna en Europa. Todavía tenemos un conflicto en cuanto al número de trabajadores en la transportación de camiones. Y dependiendo de las condiciones climatológicas, ya hemos visto cómo en años en los que no vemos mucha lluvia, por ejemplo, los niveles de agua en los ríos han bajado lo suficiente como para generar un caos en cuanto a la cantidad de materia que se puede transportar a través de las vías acuíferas y repercutiendo también en el costo que representa hacerlo. Entonces, todo esto va a seguir como parte del cambio climático que estamos viendo y va a tener consecuencias también para la industria como para cualquier otra que tiene contacto con logística de esta manera.
¿Alguna pregunta más antes de cerrar y despedir al señor Mata? Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias, ha sido un placer escucharle.
Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, que vaya muy bien, gracias. Gracias.